Welcome back, my students. Dr. Oogway here, and today I bring you the video third from the spinal cord playlist. Clearly, and this video is going to be about the nuclei of the spinal cord. Nuclei of the spinal cord. Consider we know spinal cord is a long tube-like structure. If we cut it in some place, a transverse cut. So we have the transverse section of the spinal cord. This is the transverse section of the spinal cord. Clearly, transverse section of the spinal cord. Uh, Clearly, so this shaded portion of the spinal cord is the gray matter. This is the gray matter. This gray matter of spinal cord is arranged in three horns. This is called as the anterior horn of spinal cord. This is the posterior horn of spinal cord, and this is the lateral horn of the spinal cord. So the gray matter of spinal cord is arranged in three horns: anterior horn, lateral horn, and the posterior horn. Anterior horn, lateral horn, and the posterior horn. This anterior horn is motor in function, and this posterior horn is sensory in function. And lateral horn carries efferents and afferents from viscera. Clearly, visceral, efferent, and afferent. This is the function of the lateral horn. So gray matter of the spinal cord is arranged in anterior horn, lateral horn, and posterior horn. Now we will talk about the nucleus present in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, lateral horn of the spinal cord, and posterior horn of the spinal cord. Clearly, so this diagram is given in BDC figure 3.8. You can look at this diagram. This is the posterior horn, this is the lateral horn, and this is the anterior horn of spinal cord. These are its nuclei. Nuclei in the anterior posterior horn, nuclei in the lateral horn, nuclei in the anterior horn. Clearly, so let's begin first with the nucleus in the anterior horn. Nuclei in anterior horn of spinal cord. What do you mean by nuclei? Nuclei means collection of cell body. Collection of cell body in CNS, in central nervous system. We know a neuron. A neuron consists of cell body and it consists of axon. This collection of cell body, thousands of neurons, their collection of cell body is called as the nuclei. It is also known as gray matter. Gray matter or nuclei are one or the same thing. Now moving forward, nuclei in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. Clearly, we have four nuclei. We have three nuclei in the anterior horn of spinal cord. Number first nuclei is the medial nucleus. Medial nucleus. Clearly, what is the function of this medial nucleus? We have the medial nucleus. Medial nucleus. It innervates axial muscles. Clearly, so we know we have the axial skeleton in our body and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton, the muscles of the axial skeleton are axial muscles. Those are innervated by medial nucleus. So this is the anterior horn, this is the medial part, this is the lateral part, this is the anterior part, and this is the posterior part. Clearly, so this is the cut section of the spinal cord. This is the anterior part, this is the posterior part, this is the medial part. Clearly, and here we have the medial nucleus, What is the function of this medial nucleus? Innervates axial muscles. Clearly, and it is present throughout the extent of spinal cord. We know spinal cord extends from C1 to L1. Throughout this extent, C1 to L1, this medial nucleus is present. Clearly, so we talk about the medial nucleus. We'll make a cut section of spinal cord. This is spinal cord. I will make it gray matter. This is the gray matter, and this is the anterior horn. This nucleus right here is the medial nucleus. Clearly, this is another medial nucleus. This is the anterior. This is the posterior. So what is this nucleus? This nucleus is ventromedial. Because anterior or ventral. Similarly, posterior or dorsal. And this nucleus is dorsomedial. Both these nucleus are the nucleus of the anterior horn, present in the anterior horn, where the ventromedial, dorsomedial. What is the function of the medial nucleus. The function of the medial nucleus is they innervate axial muscles and they are present throughout the extent of the spinal cord. Clearly, number second group of nucleus present in the anterior horn of the spinal cord are lateral group. Are group lateral group nuclei. Lateral group nuclei. It is present only in cervical and lumbar enlargements. We know we talked about that a spinal cord has cervical and lumbar enlargements. Only in those parts we have the presence of the lateral group. Clearly, so this lateral group has three more nuclei. This lateral group, it consists of three more nuclei: number first, number second, and number third. Clearly, so we will see that in diagram. This is the anterior horn of the spinal cord, this part right here, similarly this part right here. Now with the lateral group we have the three nuclei: one lateral, another lateral, and another lateral. Clearly, three lateral nuclei in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. This one is known as, this is the anterior of the spinal cord. This one is known as anterolateral. Clearly, this one is known as posterolateral. Clearly, and this one is known as posterolateral. So these are the three nuclei of the lateral group. These are the three nuclei of the lateral group: 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, and 3. These are the anterolateral, posterolateral, and post-posterolateral nucleus of the anterior horn of the spinal cord. What is the function of this anterolateral nuclei of the spinal cord? This anterolateral, it innervates proximal muscles of limbs. These muscles are present in, proximal part. It means shoulder. And arm in upper limb. It means gluteal region. And thigh in lower limb. So anterolateral nucleus, it innervates proximal muscles of limbs. Proximal muscles towards the body. The muscles of shoulder and arm, the muscles of gluteal region and thigh. Clearly, now we talk about the posterolateral nuclei. This posterolateral nuclei, it innervates this posterolateral nuclei. Clearly, it innervates intermediate muscles of limbs. Clearly, upper limb and lower limb. That's forearm, muscles of forearm, and muscles of leg. Clearly, so this posterolateral nucleus, it innervates muscles of limbs. That's the muscles of the forearm and leg. Now we talk about this nuclei, posterolateral nuclei. This posterolateral nuclei, it innervates distal muscles. What are those distal muscles? Those are the muscles of hand and foot. Or we can say it innervates distal segments. Distal segments include hand in upper limb and foot in lower limb. So this completes the lateral group of nuclei in the anterior horn. Lateral nuclei in the anterior horn. So anterior horn, we have the medial nuclei, we have the lateral group nuclei. Clearly, now moving on. Now this is the spinal cord. Clearly, cut section of the spinal cord. This is the anterior, or we can say ventral. This is the posterior or oblique dorsal. Clearly, and we draw the gray matter. This is the anterior horn. We talk about the medial nuclei. These are the medial nuclei, and we talk about the lateral nuclei. These three are the lateral nuclei. Now we talk about the another nucleus in the anterior horn. Those are called as the intermediate nucleus. Intermediate nuclei. These intermediate nuclei, it has two nuclei. This intermediate nuclei has two nuclei. Number first, this is the intermediate nuclei. I will draw in green color. This is the number first intermediate nuclei of the anterior horn, and this is the another intermediate nuclei of the anterior horn. Clearly, this nuclei is the nuclei of the phrenic nerve. Phrenic nerve, it supplies diaphragm. Its segments are C4, C3, C4, C5, C3 to C5. Clearly, and this nuclei is for spinal accessory nerve. This nuclei is for spinal accessory. This nuclei is for spinal accessory nerve, whose root value is C1 to C5. Clearly, so we talked about all the nuclei of the spinal cord present in the anterior horn. In the anterior horn, we have the medial nuclei, two medial nuclei. Clearly, then we have the lateral nuclei, 1, 2, and 3. Then we have the intermediate nuclei, which are two in number. This nuclei and this nuclei. This nuclei is for the phrenic nerve, and this nuclei is for the spinal accessory nerve. Clearly, spinal accessory nerve. So these are the three nuclei present in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. Now we talk about the nuclei present in the posterior horn of the spinal cord. Posterior horn of the spinal cord. First, we will draw a spinal cord. This is the cut section of the spinal cord. Now we will draw the gray matter. Clearly, this is the anterior horn. Clearly, we talked about this nuclei. Now we'll talk about the post nuclei in the posterior horn. This is the posterior or dorsal. Posterior horn nuclei. Posterior horn nuclei. Number first nuclei is right here near the tip. Clearly, this is known as substantia gelatinosa. This is the nuclei number first. That's known as substantia gelatinosa. Substantia gelatinosa. Where is my sharpener? I can't find my sharpener. So let's begin. This is the number first. Substantia gelatinosa. Gelatinosa. Substantia gelatinosa. So this substantia gelatinosa, what it is present? It is present at the tip of the posterior horn. It is present at the tip of the posterior horn. Clearly, this is the posterior horn tip. And number second point, it is throughout the. It is present throughout the extent of spinal cord. Extent of spinal cord. Clearly, and it has a nucleus. It has a nucleus for spinothalamic tract. Spinothalamic tract. What do you mean by spinothalamic tract? It is a separate topic we will discuss in the tracts of the spinal cord. So first nucleus in the posterior horn is substantia gelatinosa. Number second nucleus is adjacent to substantia gelatinosa. It's right here. It's called as the nucleus proprius. It's called as nucleus proprius. It's called nucleus proprius. It is adjacent to substantia gelatinosa. It is also present throughout the extent of spinal cord. Clearly, number second point in the nucleus proprius. And number third point, few fibers of dorsal column relay here. Few fibers of dorsal column relay here. Dorsal column we will also study in tracts of the spinal cord in another lecture. Column relay here. To elicit reflex. Clearly. So two nucleus so far in the posterior horn. Number first is substantia gelatinosa. Adjacent to substantia gelatinosa, we have the nucleus proprius. Clearly, another nucleus is called as the Clark's column. That's here, Clark's column. So this nucleus, this is the third nucleus. This third nucleus is Clark's column. What is the function of the Clark's column? It has a nucleus. For spinocerebellar pathway. Spinocerebellar pathway. It is another tract that we will study later. Spinocerebellar pathway. Clearly, and its extent is C3 to L3 segments. Only in these segments, C3 to L3 segments, is the presence of the Clark's column. Unlike substantia gelatinosa and nucleus proprius, they are present throughout the spinal cord. This is the extent of the spinal cord. Throughout the extent, we have the presence of substantia gelatinosa and nucleus proprius. But this Clark's column, it's present only in C3 to C8 to L3 segments. C8 to L3 segments. Moving forward. So this is the cut section of the spinal cord. Clear? So this is the posterior horn of spinal cord. This is the posterior horn of spinal cord. Number first, we have the substantia gelatinosa. Then we talked about this is substantia gelatinosa. Then we talked about nucleus proprius. Then we talked about Clark's column. This is the Clark's column. The Clark's column. Another nucleus is present in the posterior horn, that is called as the posterior marginal nucleus. That's right here. This is the posterior marginal nucleus. Posterior marginal nucleus. Posterior marginal nucleus. Posterior marginal nucleus. Clearly. So, what is the function of the posterior marginal nucleus? It receives some of incoming dorsal root fibers. Dorsal root fibers. Clearly, dorsal root fibers. It receives those fibers from dorsal root fibers. Incoming dorsal root fibers. Those fibers are received by posterior marginal nucleus. Clearly, so we talked about the four nucleus of the posterior horn. Number first, posterior marginal nucleus. Then we have the substantia gelatinosa. Then nucleus proprius. This is the nucleus proprius. Then Clark's column. Now we talk about the nucleus in the lateral horn of the spinal cord. Lateral horn of the spinal cord. So we'll make a spinal cord. This is a spinal cord, cut section of the spinal cord. Clearly, so this is the gray matter. This whole is gray matter. This is the gray matter of the spinal cord, and this is the lateral horn of the spinal cord. Lateral horn of the spinal cord. It has only two nuclei. One is the medial nuclei. And another is the lateral nuclei. This is towards the median. So this is the medial nucleus. Medial nucleus, and this is the lateral nucleus. Lateral nucleus. Clearly, lateral nucleus. This medial nucleus is for parasympathetic. Parasympathetic, whereas this lateral nucleus is sympathetic. Sympathetic supply. Clearly, the root value of parasympathetic is S2 to S4, whereas the root value of sympathetic is T1 to L2. So these are all the nuclei of the spinal cord. We can see its diagram from the BDC. From the BDC diagram, you can see this is the posterior horn of the spinal cord. We have four nuclei. This is the posterior marginal nucleus. This is the substantia gelatinosa. This is the nucleus proprius. Then we have the Clark's column. These four nuclei, here four nuclei, here four nuclei of the posterior horn. Then two nuclei. This is the medial lateral nuclei, and this is the medial nuclei of the lateral horn of the spinal cord. Then we have the anterior horn of the spinal cord. We have the two medial nuclei. This one is ventromedial, and this one is the posterior medial. Clearly, then three lateral groups, 1, 2, and 3. These are the lateral nuclei, and one nuclei for the spinal accessory nerve. This one, and this one for the phrenic nerve. So these are the nuclei of the spinal cord that we studied in this lecture. Clearly, that we studied in this lecture. Thank you very much. One last point here. If we draw a spinal cord, clearly, one last cut section of the spinal cord. Clearly, from here, clearly, this is called as the dorsal root. Dorsal root. Clearly, and this is called as the ventral root. Dorsal root usually comes from the posterior horn, and the ventral root from the anterior horn. Clearly, the dorsal root and the ventral root, they combine to form a spinal nerve. From this side as well. Clearly, these are the nerve rootlets 1, 2, 3, 4, and these are the nerve. This is nerve 1. Together, they are the pair of spinal nerve. Clearly, so this was the topic about the nuclei of the spinal cord. You keep on revising this topic, and you will get. Thank you very much.